in right now. We got John Speed Meyers. How's it going, John?
Going well. How are you doing, Matt?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. You know, just trying to have a great day, have some fun. Russ, how you doing?
Good, thanks, Mohawk.
Hey, you're welcome. I think you should. Could you get a mohawk? I could give you one. You can tape on.
Those days are long behind me, friend.
Hey, I got friends in rapid prototyping and 3D printing. We could 3D print you one. Well, I have some mentors or friends who are who making me some 3D printed models just in case I lose my hair one day. That way I can still represent, you know, kind of like Yondu from Guardians of the Galaxy. Just gonna slap it on.
I'm sure we can get an AI filter to put a mohawk on my head. That shouldn't be too tough.
Gerald's saying we should do another fundraiser. Mike Steiner, one of the speakers this morning, a few months ago, I did a fundraiser with him for Gold Star Family and raised money. And to do that, we shaved his mohawk live on my LinkedIn, and then people donated. So we could do reverse. So the more money we get, the more ridiculous mohawk we have to stick on Russ Andersson's head. Kind of thing. Merry freaking Poppins, y'all. You're right, William. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. We're gonna get started. We'll give people another minute just for a break. And I'll let you guys bleed into the break for a second. Jacket, thanks. You know, get your local fine tailored establishment such as Walmart. I think I owe you a shaved head. Hey, Gerald, we can do that. Let's shave your head live. I'm all about that. Let's do fundraiser. I'll be in where you live in Christmas. So the more money, the more hair follicles filled in. Unfortunately, we only raised $100. There you go. Love it. Whipple wapple. So welcome, everyone. We're going to get this session started. We're going to have a great session. And I keep saying they are going to have a great session and some great experts today. They are going to talk about supply chain security. Excuse me. What that means, how it all integrates, and this is your chance to not only learn kind of the basics of supply chain security, get an introduction of it, but also grill them with the questions. If you're facing this problem now and you already know things that they can help you with, ask those questions. Put them in the chat. Put them in the Q&A section. Raise your hand near the end. Maybe I can bring you on stage. Ask the question. Bring the heat. Make these guys work for. They're just sitting home anyway. Make them work for this. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to them. We're going to start John Speed Meyers from Chainguard and Russ Andersson from Rapidfort. The floor is yours, gentlemen.
Sounds great. Thank you. So we can start with some quick introductions here about who we are and why we're presenting, and then we'll get into an overview of the topic. And we would love to take questions while we do this too. So I'm a principal security scientist at Chainguard. Chainguard is a software supply chain security startup. So if you're here for physical supply chain security, I'm sorry, I've got nothing for you. But if you're interested in software supply chain security, Russ and I do have something to talk about. I am personally a recovering defense analyst. I did a wide range of military research, mostly on technology and acquisition at the RAND Corporation, and then worked at In-Q-Tel, something like the intelligence community's VC in their R&D lab before coming to Chainguard about a year ago. So I'm excited to be here and talk with all of you today, and I'll pass it over to Russ.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks to the DU folks for having us. You've been wonderful partners and ambassadors for this community that is thriving, and we're delighted to be a part of it. I'm even rocking my Zarf shirt, which you kindly gave me. Yes, so I have known John or been aware of his writings for a number of years. It's my real pleasure and privilege to present with him. And John actually does some pretty thought-provocative perspective pieces from time to time, and I'm just going to drop his website in the chat. But in terms of my background, I'm an entrepreneur, investor, and operator. I'm one of the co-founders of Rapidfort. I'm on the commercial side. I have two other technical co-founders who do the more complex aspects of our product, and really interested in solving complex problems, which software supply chain is. And that's a good segue to transition over to John in terms of understanding some of the basics.
Yeah, I think before we dive into any technical details, I think there's just a broader question of why should one care about software supply chain security? What does it matter to you, to your organization? How would you justify it to a boss or superior? And I'm going to offer two reasons, but there could be many more. One is that your staff likely wrote very little of the code your organization relies on. There's a stat that floats around that comes from a couple software security companies, Sonatype and Synopsys, especially, that 80% of modern applications are open source software, and therefore you're mostly relying on other people, other institutions' code. I had actually gotten interested in this topic and investigated it with a friend, Julius Mousseau, and some other co-authors. And the funny thing is, they were right, but they didn't even realize how right they were. In fact, some of the code bases, some of the smaller code bases we analyzed were 99.9% software that that organization didn't write. So, so you should care about this because that software has properties, whether it's performance, reliability, but also security, both malicious and unintentional vulnerabilities that affect your organization, your application, your job. So that's the first reason. And the second reason is that it turns out, I mean, not only is the actual code you write important, but how you build that code. And I mean a broad definition of build. How you build that code has security implications. The source code management system and the controls you have, the build system you use, how you distribute that code, and all of that can be compromised and can make your day bad. And the famous ones like SolarWinds happened, but the truth is, and we'll discuss this a little bit more, there's actually a wide range of different types of software supply chain compromises, and all of them unfortunately have an increasing number of examples over the past few years. So that's what I would offer. Russ might have others, and I'm glad to discuss others and questions too.
Yes, sure, John. We'll discuss that in a little bit, but at the end of the day, there are a number of definitions around software supply chain security. Ours is, at Rapidfort, the systemic risk that arises from using software component or applications not developed internally. And as we all know, software is everywhere. Software is indeed eating the world. It's in our locks, it's in our cars, obviously it's in our phones and communication devices. And when you talk about software supply chain security, there's not only the components of the building or the end result, there's the entire raw materials, as it were, built using a construction analogy, how the house is actually, or the software is built, and all the build infrastructure, what is ultimately built, and then how it's deployed. And all of this essentially sits on a software framework. And the net result is that there's an ever-increasing attack surface that needs to be defended. And that's essentially the topic of this talk. And we're going to come at it from a variety of perspectives. So I've alluded to this previously, that software is everywhere. And when we look at how software was built only 15 years ago, it was built by essentially a single team using a lot of internal components that was deployed on your own data centers and released in waterfall methodologies. And so it was a very bounded problem. You contrast that today, much of the software that's in your infrastructure, you didn't write. It's built rapidly and released without a security personnel essentially have the ability to be the gatekeeper. It's running on somebody else's infrastructure. And all of this is essentially outside of your locus of control. And so the game has changed. And the reason why this has emerged is because of the obvious benefits in using DevSecOps in terms of cost, performance, deployment cadence, ability to innovate, and so forth. So we're not going back to the old world. We'll continue with these modern methodologies, but we have to fix them. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is some foundational things that you can do in terms of very simple practices to allow you to identify software supply chain risk in your organization. And that topic is essentially around scanning. But the key takeaway for everyone on the call is it's not our software. There's a lot of it. It's risky. The tools to understand where the risks are imperfect, and we often rely on third parties to provide the risks, the patching, and the security. So the locus of control in modern software has essentially shifted. And so Rob obviously has a mathematical background, and no presentation would be complete without a bit of basic math to understand the problem. And there are a couple of dynamics that make the software supply chain risk interesting. The first is just the number of components that are now in the delivery system and in the system themselves have exploded and exponentially grown. And if you simply assume that you have a 20 component system and there's a 2% chance of any one of those components being breached in isolation in a single year, when you daisy chain all of these links together, you get actually a system which in aggregate is less secure. And if you think of a software infrastructure as being like a house with a bunch of doors, if you have 100 doors and each one of them is 99% secure, after you go and rattle all the doors, it's mathematically likely for you to actually gain entrance into the house. And so the compounding effect of all these complicated systems that are chained together is the first reason why there's this fundamental problem. The second is you're only as strong as your weakest link. And we saw that in Uber, in the sense that we understand, we speak to Uber, they're actually a very legitimate and sophisticated security organization, but they had one employee who unfortunately did something unwise, and the net result is that they suffered an incredibly severe breach. And so you're only as strong as your weakest link because of this essentially daisy chaining effect. And it's compounded by the fact that these chains and these interlinks and this sort of compounding of components is growing, because now we're working from home. There's more devices accessing the network. There's open source components. There's third-party providers and all of those types of things. And so at the core of it, we have to understand and accept that this complexity is creating structural reasons as to why the security challenge has actually gone up.
So I think one of the things that's useful when considering software supply chain compromises is really what are the different types of attacks? What are these different compromises and how common are they? So what I'm going to present here is a simple typology. Like all typologies, it's not perfect. That comes from a 2020 paper with Dan Geer, myself, and another, try to count, well, how many of the different types of software supply chain compromises are there? And I'll just say that this is not looking at log4j style attacks either. This is not about vulnerable components that have unintentional vulnerabilities. This is only about malicious compromise. And we said at the broadest level, there's really two types. There's compromises with your build, source, and publishing infrastructure. So you do have some control, at least over what you use and how you do it. And then there's software registries. I saw NPM just got mentioned a minute ago in the chat. NPM's got a bad rap for a reason. But these are using the Python package index or NPM or others. And it turns out that there are a wide variety of compromises in here too. And I'll say a quick word about the notation. You'll see these number, : what's going on here that doesn't make sense. Well, there's no accepted methodology for counting software supply chain compromises, unfortunately. So what we did is we said, well, you could either count the number of reports. This is like a security white paper or a news article reporting on one thing, or the number of attacks. Sometimes reports document several attacks. So it's reports : attacks. And what you'll see, the most obvious takeaway here is that these build, source, and publishing infrastructure attacks, they are relatively infrequent. They do happen, but they take skill. and attacker capability. While the software registry attacks, a lot of those take relatively little skill, and as a consequence, they're very common. So really the main point to take away here is that software supply chain security risk is not simply one or even two attack vectors. It's a range. I'm glad to talk about the specifics, but there's probably no single tool that simply secures your software supply chain. So I'll pass it back to Russ, or maybe actually there's one more slide I'll talk about. And I think another thing that comes up when you hear about software supply chain security is, rightfully so, you sometimes hear, was there really anything new here? Why discuss this topic now? This question could be answered with a yes or a no, depending upon your perspective. Turns out that software supply chain security, at least as a theoretical concern, goes back decades for sure, at least to the 80s, arguably before. But at least according to the work I've done, there are really only concrete, tangible examples of this starting about 20 years ago, but they remained rare and frequent. But over the past 5 years or so, now 6 or 7 years, this data was collected in 2020, it's exploded in frequency. And so it's not just about these high profile attacks you see in the Washington Post or Wall Street Journal, where it's Log4j or SolarWinds. There's actually a range of software supply chain compromises, and they're growing in number. So that's the new part here. Back over to you, Russ.
So software supply chain risk is a very broad topic, but there are some foundational and simple and effective things that you can do cost effectively and almost immediately that can allow you to start on your journey towards maturity. And the first is scanning. And when we talk about scanning, there are essentially SCA scanners, software composition analysis scanners, that allow you to scan your software artifact, typically a container, and it tells you the list of packages in the artifact, as well as the vulnerabilities, and it can cross-reference a number of other risk sources. And so if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this, is that SCA scanning is the foundation of everything. There are a number of free and good open source scanners. Trivy is one. Anchor has another offering. We have one, for example, and so forth. And so these are relatively accessible, low cost, and really, really effective as foundational. The way it actually works, all these scanners work, they have different techniques, but ultimately you get a list of the packages, and there's a number of ways that you can actually get this. And then once you have the list of packages, you can then cross-reference those packages to see to risk databases that can provide vulnerabilities and other scoring things. So imagine you have a software container, it has packages 1, 2, 3. After you've identified that, you then go and look in a database, tell me all about package 1, tell me all about package 2, 3, and so forth. And so that is essentially what a scanner does. It gets the list of packages, it cross-references it with risk sources, and then it tabulates the results. There are a number of ways to look at your scanning needs. The first is, or measure the effectiveness of scanning. The first is accuracy. Does it detect all the packets? And so there's a package detection component to a scanner. And then how effectively does it cross-reference with these databases? Because there is a normalization component in the database, call it package 123, and you could have package .123. And so normalizing the data affects accuracy. There's scan depth in terms of what does it actually look at? Does it look at the application code? Does it look at the open source technologies if it has there? Does it look at the operating system? There's also, a scan is only as good as the data that actually, or the risks that it links to. And so there are some databases that are better than others. And so there is an opportunity to link to proprietary databases and so forth. And then ultimately, it's a question of coverage. what percentage of your infrastructure are you scanning? Are you scanning just your containers, or your VMs, or all of it? Interestingly enough, scanning is obviously linked with the term SBOM, Software Bill of Materials, and in the federal space, there's a tremendous amount of compliance regulation driving this adoption. But the latest figures are surprising in industry, that only 40% of companies are using SCA scanners, even though they're freely available, quite effective, and all of these things. And the reason for that is the majority of companies are dissatisfied with the results of the scans and so forth. So on the right-hand side is a very simple example of a scan result. You can see the package name and the CVE and so forth. Obviously, more elaborate scanners have much more elaborate things. So in selecting a scanner, there are a number of things that you should think about. You should think about the tech stack that you're interested in supporting. There's a huge difference between Windows and Linux. There's very few Windows scanners, and they tend to be paid, and there's an abundance of Linux scanners. So understand where your infrastructure is with respect to that. Some scanners are better at others at detecting packages. Some scanners use broader databases. Some scanners are standalone, or they come bundled with other services and things like that. In terms of matching your workflows, a lot of companies require you to scan when you build and scan when you deploy. And so you need to make sure that you've got the APIs and the reports that enable you to get the information to support that development priority. There's a premium placed on reports. For example, one of the free scanners is SNCC, but it doesn't allow you to download the reports or export the reports. So understanding who's actually going to consume the data in which format, machine readable, human readable, and so forth, is an important thing. But ultimately, you want a scanner that if it says there's a problem, there is actually a problem. And you want to be able to indicate compliance with scanning, so that there's an audit trail, who scanned, when they scanned, what they scanned, and so forth. And the two really good scanners that are available are Trivi. It's produced by an Israeli company called Aqua Security. I'd say it's probably the gold standard in terms of open source scanners. And then Anchor has two products, but you can combine them together to essentially get the equivalent of an industrial SBOM. There's a bunch of other things that you could look at with respect to scanning. I'd be happy to come back to this slide, but for all intents and purposes, that's the sort of real basics around SCA scanning.
So we just got an overview of scanning and selecting scanners, and I think it points to a broader problem, which is some of the software artifacts that get used to get your work done as a software developer, before you even add your own code, have a lot of known vulnerabilities in it. And that creates problems, whether or not it's security problems or it's the burden of having to triage it. There's a lot of problems, especially in regulated software systems where there's critical security needs. So what I'm showing here, the particular numbers don't matter so much as the colors, I'll explain, is several very popular container-based images. This very first component you need to use when you're building a container-based application and deploying things, for instance, to Kubernetes. A colleague and I, you can find this, it's published, it's called All About That Base Image, chose several very popular, talking billions of downloads, container-based images and scanned them with Trivi, which we just heard about, Gripe, and one called, it's Docker Scan or Sneak, it's really the same thing. We said, well, how many known vulnerabilities are in these base images at the start of your application development process? And it turns out for Node, for instance, we were talking about NPM in the chat earlier, there are hundreds, no matter the scanner, there are hundreds of known vulnerabilities in this popular open source Docker Hub image. For Debian, there's tens. Even for Red Hat, the universal base image, there's very few critical or high, you'll notice. But there are, no matter the scanner, there are tens of medium and low severity vulnerabilities. So this is a big bummer for organizations that are trying to have no CVEs in the software they deploy, because or at least no reachable ones, because now you have a lot. You don't know if they matter for security or not, and someone has to go through all of that and figure it out. And that is probably not the job you want to be doing. So the question is, can something be done about that? And I think there's one, you can choose the appropriate, better scanners. And so you need to go to the scanner marketplace, talk to Russ for that. He's the expert. And there are some other, I call them loosely tree shaking approaches, where you can try to, Rapidfort specializes in this too, of trying to figure out what's not being used and not use those components and reduce these counts. But there's another approach too. And if you go one more slide, please. Russ, Oh, there it is. Perfect. Thank you. Which is, what about using container-based images that are designed from the get-go to have no or low CVE counts? And there are antecedents for this. Chainguard and Chainguard's open source images are not the first to embrace this principle, but what you're seeing here is a graph that shows several very popular container images from Docker Hub, just pulled their latest version each day over a month for Go, PGP, Nginx, several very popular ones. And then the open source Chainguard equivalent ones based on Chainguard tooling that all have 0. And you'll say, oh my gosh, so what explains this dramatic difference? Exactly. Thank you so much, Rob, for putting Wolfie up. These are actually Alpine based, but Chainguard images in the future will be all Wolfie based. It's a distribution of sorts. What this suggests is that there are principles that allow you to have no or low CVE count base images. And I'll just tell you those principles. It's not a secret. One is to use relatively minimal base images. Oftentimes the base image you pull off Docker Hub or use has more components than you actually need. As a consequence, those extra components bring in vulnerabilities, and that's how you end up with counts in the hundreds. Second, you want those components to be up to date, fresh, some of the Chainguard tooling, open source. There's this thing called APKO. Glad to talk to you about it. It's an open source tool, helps you make sure you're building a new container image with the latest components at least once a day or however often you want to. So you can contact me at my email there, jsmeyers@chainguard.dev, or you can go click on that web app link. But if you want to learn more about no or low CVE count base images, it is possible. So I'll pass it back to Russ at this point.
Yes, so the Chainguard approach is one way of addressing this proliferation of components, and they start with a very small base image. And as we refer back to the math, the images have so many less components, this sort of ability to control and focus is greatly improved. We come at it from a different perspective, in that rather than start with these sanitized base images, which can be difficult to produce and work with at times, we actually take the components out downstream. And essentially, the key finding is that between 50 and 90% of your software is actually not required to run in production. We mentioned package managers, and NPM was mentioned in the chat. Package managers were designed to pull every possible combination of dependencies that you might need in. And the net result is you end up with this big spaghetti ball of anything possible that could be needed. Rapidfort essentially reverses that effect, where we instrument the code as it runs. We learn the specific components that are needed for it to operate, and then we give you tools to either deprioritize, i.e. you can say this component is not lost, not hot, it's not loaded into memory, it's not exploitable, or to iteratively remove components using a variety of arguments. You can specify what to keep and what to exclude, remove criticals and highs, and all of those things. And as John indicated, software supply chain risk is a very complicated and broad problem, and there's a variety of ways to address it. Another component that Chainguard does is it only allows you to load essentially pre-approved components. We have a similar approach as well, and that's where we have a lot of alignment. One, I do understand that there is a fairly large DoD audience as a result of a partnership with Platform One, and in fact with Defense Unicorns, who helped get us certified. We do have a ability to allow you to test the system. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to me at the email below. With that being said, I think we have a few more minutes here, so happy to turn things over for questions or comments. I'm just scanning here.
Feel free to put questions in the chat too. We're glad to just read them out loud and then answer them too.
Sure. So I had a question for you, John. In terms of the prioritization of which ecosystems you're interested in supporting first, are you in a situation to comment on what sort of guided that in terms of where you're focusing?
I'm curious exactly what you mean here. Do you mean me personally in my research, or do you mean the images that we're focusing on?
The images, the Chainguard images.
Yeah, well, I think what I can just do is drop in a link here that shows you the ones that we have. We open source, we probably have about 20 different images right now. And I think that the obvious way to do it is, just some ecosystems are more popular than others. And so that's where we focus. So I'll just name some of those things. So PHP, as we mentioned, there's a Python base image. There's a GCC. This is getting really into weeds, but for people who care about compilers and what C code they're using, there's a GCC glibc one. There's BusyBox, Ruby. We do have an Alpine-based one, got an Nginx, Postgres, Go. So, a wide variety, but this is one of the interesting things about kind of the programming world these days is there's such a wide variety of programming languages and so many niches within them. It's hard to cover them all. So we certainly have plans to keep adding them as their requests. And this is and there are open source versions of these. I just dropped it into the webinar chat. So you can take a look. You can pull them off our registry. Try them out. It's open source. And then there's a tiered pricing scheme where should you desire more support or different images, that's what you pay for.
Cool. Thank you for that. I've dropped our images, which are free to use as well, in the chat, and feel free to use those and see how you get on. We have had a question from the audience, which says, can you talk to the noise felt with current scanning approaches? And I'm happy to take that one on.
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. So when we talk about noise, we talk about three things. We talk about, firstly, the volume of results. And what typically happens is an image will have between 150 and 300 vulnerabilities on average. And so there's just an incredible amount of information that you need to process, stack rank, and so forth. So there's a volume issue. Then there's an accuracy issue in that scanners produce false positives and false negatives. A false positive being, it tells you that one of the components in your infrastructure is actually there, and it's not. And that's problematic because you allocate resources to go and fix a problem you don't even have. The other is a false negative, and this is perhaps the more damaging one, where the scanner doesn't actually detect a package that may have a critical vulnerability in it. And when you start using the scanners, you'll see that there is no consensus on terms of what actually is in the application. Trivy, our scanner, SNCC, and so forth, they very rarely uniformly agree. And the reason for that is they use different techniques for actually detecting the packages. And so there's high volume, there's a lot of false positives and false negatives, and there's no universal source of truth with any consistency. And so that's what makes the problem murky. In terms of, John, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've covered the major points. I think there are ways to make scanners more effective. There's actually partnerships to be had between different software supply chain security companies. I'll just mention one of the techniques that is really going on under the hood often with scanners is that they are looking at package manifest lists. Most different programming language ecosystems and operating systems, they have some sort of metadata they have that they describe about what's in here. And these scanners go and look at that metadata and say, oh, there are these package passengers here. Well, unfortunately, there are ways to put pieces of software components into containers or other things without actually putting that metadata in there. And so I think as a general principle, you want to be using software artifacts that have their metadata well described such that then scanners can work well with them. And that second part, you as a consumer don't have control over, only very distantly how well the scanners do, but you have control over the metadata, And so by using operating system package managers, by using programming language specific package managers, you can increase the metadata available to these scanners. And so for instance, this APKO tool I dropped in earlier, it makes sure that it's using the operating system package manager of Alpine, it's called APK, to package up stuff and make sure there's metadata. So I think there are partnerships between, Rapidfort style scanners and build development tools to be had.
Sure. Yes. And so the majority of scanners inspect the metadata, interrogate the metadata, and use that. For some languages, our scanner actually looks at the file directory themselves, which is somewhat unusual. And that's what tends to provide a lot of the deltas. We have had an interesting question in terms of what does the future look like? What does a foolproof solution look like? Is their approach much further into a mature future where we rely on more than scanning for known threats? Zero trust architectures being one suggestion. That's a great question, and I'm happy to provide a perspective on that. John, do you want to lead off?
I need a second to think. If you already have a perspective, feel free to go, but I'm glad to pontificate if you prefer me to start. So.
It's a good question. My personal belief is that we need to move beyond a detection mindset and philosophy and more into a risk-based mindset and philosophy. And what I mean by that is scanners only tell you what's there. They don't tell you the risks of what's there. And the next generation of tools will be less about showing you what's there and more about showing you what's risky. And so if you imagine the perfect scanner, imagine this Star Trek-like dashboard that only puts a check engine light on when a material risk arises. And so I see the industry converging towards a world where you have large platforms that aggregate a wide variety of risks and essentially give you much more granular risk information. The check engine light is on, you're out of oil, or the water coolant's low, and so forth. And so it becomes more actionable. There are some companies that are heading in this direction. And I think the future ultimately looks relatively bright in terms of how we can remediate these risks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a valid perspective and certainly should be pursued. I guess I would offer, in addition, and I think this reflects just different philosophies that you should feel free to simultaneously engage in, is there's just the potential of instead of using components and then trying to figure out what their risks are, to use known good components from the start. Like I said, these philosophies they don't contradict each other. They're just a different perspective. And so You've already seen this. Sometimes you'll see this with how Linux distributions and others operate. They have a controlled ecosystem that builds trust in one way or another. And I think that partly what has happened is these open source programming language ecosystems have exploded so much, and they offer a lot of vulnerabilities. They offer a lot of opportunities, but that freedom actually comes with some security vulnerabilities too. And so there are ways to curate and create known good collections of components and aggregations of components, containers, for instance. And I think that's another promising direction.
Yes, I agree. The one consideration that's worth discussing is that I think the way open source software is developed is going to change, in the sense that open source has now become such a critical part of everyone's infrastructure. The governance and essentially the commercialization and the way the open source ecosystem is likely to change. I don't know what it's going to change to. There's a number of thoughts in these communities. One is essentially to a situation where contributorship is more transparent. We know who you are, and you go through some form of vetting process and so forth. There's another thought around commercialization, i.e. paying maintainers to actually maintain the software and so forth. But I do think that having keeping an eye on how the open source ecosystem evolves is going to be very informative in terms of how this problem is ultimately resolved. Sure. So there is Mohawk was back. There was some discussion in the chat around detection, and that is that there are tool sets that do this, essentially SIEMs, SIEMs, and XDR tool sets and so forth. And the idea being logging what the software is doing, and then if it does anything unusual, for you to throw a notification. The problem with this is essentially the same problem with scanning. Is there's so much noise, there's so many alerts, there's alert fatigue and so forth, that approach is somewhat viable for very structured use cases, but it's not fully available for the majority of us. It's something more of an enterprise level type of exercise.
So I have a question, and this could show my dumbness, which everyone knows these are not my topics. But so as an everyday person, how does supply chain security matter to me? Like just on my personal devices, doing things like, is that something that hopefully is being done before it gets to me? But how can like I make sure as just a regular person that I'm doing what I can for those that may not be following what you guys do?
Yeah, I mean,
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I mean, I think this unfortunately does apply even to individuals outside of your corporate context or larger organizational context. That said, I actually think the sad truth is there's relatively little the individual can do. There's certainly some basic hygiene things, but the software supply chain is opaque and murky even to well-resourced individuals and companies, let alone consumers. And I'll just mention where it shows up, and I think it is a software supply chain security concern, but sometimes gets left out is mobile app stores. The mobile app providers and who run stores, they actually spend a lot of time trying to keep those stores safe, exactly because it's a software supply chain security concern. But it turns out to be hard to know what's good and what's bad. There are many technical approaches to doing it before an app gets in an app store, but there's been known malware in mobile app stores. So even, personal, in your personal life, if you use a mobile app store, you've probably actually, in some sense, at least indirectly interacted with software supply chain security.
Yeah, I think it's a very broad topic. It tends to be more of a corporate type of issue, but for a retail user, just be very sensitive to any software that you download, either on your PC or on your mobile device. I recently heard of a hack last night where a false a 1-800 number was established for eBay and these companies. And if you have a complaint, you call the 1-800 number, they send you a link, and click on the link will start helping you. And that obviously leads, clicking on that link installs the device, and you lose complete control. And so there's a tremendous range of exploit vectors, and there's a tremendous amount of creativity. And so just be really, really careful in terms of software that you use, because it can come with consequences.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Well, yeah, we're just coming up on a couple minutes left. If there's any other questions, throw them in the chat. But in the meantime, really, did the Q&A get answered? Yeah, it did. Perfect. Yeah, really thank John and Russ. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much to you. Yeah, and Defense Unicorns, we really appreciate being here.
Well said. Likewise, John. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,